The infrared signature bloomed on Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reeves' thermal scope like a dying star. Through the green-tinted darkness of his night vision, the Taliban compound sprawled below their overwatch position, a maze of mud-brick walls and corrugated metal roofing that had become their prison for the last 14 hours. The 8-man SEAL team had been pinned down since 3:47 hours, caught in a surveillance mission that had gone catastrophically wrong when a goat herder stumbled into their hide site and triggered the hornet's nest below. Blackwater 6, this is Trident Actual, Reeves whispered into his radio, voice barely audible above the sporadic crack of AK-47 fire echoing off the valley walls. We are danger close on all sides. Enemy strength estimated at 40+ fighters. Request immediate air support, over. The response crackled back through static-laden comms, the voice of their tactical operations center sounding impossibly distant. Trident Actual, Blackwater 6. All fixed-wing assets are committed to operations north of your position. Nearest available CAS is 27 minutes out. 27 minutes. Reeves closed his eyes and felt the weight of command settle heavier on his shoulders. His men were spread across a ridgeline no bigger than a basketball court, their ammunition running dangerously low. Petty Officer Rodriguez had taken shrapnel to his left shoulder from an RPG that had detonated against the rocks above them. The corpsman, Gutierrez, had done what he could, but Rodriguez needed a real hospital, not field dressings and morphine. The mystery began with a radio transmission that shouldn't have existed. At 15:47 hours, when hope was a luxury they could no longer afford, an unfamiliar voice cut through their tactical frequency with crystalline clarity. Trident Actual, this is Ghost Rider. I show your position. Stand by for close air support. Reeves exchanged glances with his radio operator, Petty Officer Hayes, whose eyebrows disappeared beneath his helmet rim. Ghost Rider wasn't on their air tasking order. Hell, Ghost Rider wasn't on any frequency they'd ever heard. Every pilot in theater had a call sign they knew. Every aircraft had a designation that appeared on their Blue Force tracker. This voice belonged to no one. Ghost Rider, Trident Actual, Reeves responded, professional skepticism warring with desperate hope. Say aircraft type and ordnance available. The pause stretched long enough for another burst of enemy fire to rake their position, sending limestone chips cascading down the cliff face. When the voice returned, it carried something that made the hair on Reeves' neck stand up, absolute, unshakable confidence that belonged to someone who had done this dance before. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the Hindu Kush peaks, painting the valley in shades of amber and shadow. In 6 hours, darkness would provide cover for movement, but 6 hours might as well have been 6 years. The Taliban fighters below had settled into a patient siege, content to wait for nightfall when they could close the noose. They had time, territory, and numbers. The SEALs had rocks, limited ammunition, and a mysterious voice on the radio promising salvation that might not exist. Reeves studied the compound through his scope, counting muzzle flashes and marking fighting positions. 43 confirmed fighters, probably more inside the buildings. 3 heavy machine gun nests, 2 possible mortar positions, and enough small arms fire to turn their rocky perch into a killing field if they tried to move. The mathematics of their situation were brutally simple. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. Ghost Rider, Trident Actual, Reeves tried again, his voice carrying the weight of 8 lives. We need to authenticate your mission. What's your authentication code? Static filled the channel for long seconds before the voice returned, and when it did, there was something different in its tone, a thread of dark humor that somehow made everything more unsettling. Trident Actual, Ghost Rider. Authentication is simple. You're about to see something that doesn't officially exist. The radio went silent, leaving only the wind through the rocks and the distant sound of enemy fighters repositioning in the valley below. Reeves felt his stomach tighten. In 15 years of special operations, he'd learned to trust his instincts, And right now, every instinct was screaming that they were about to become part of something much larger and more dangerous than a routine surveillance mission gone wrong. The sun continued its relentless descent toward the western peaks, and somewhere in the growing shadows, 8 American warriors waited for a ghost that might be their salvation or their doom. The first indication that Ghost Rider was more than radio chatter came 23 minutes later, when Petty Officer Hayes picked up an electronic signature on his handheld spectrum analyzer. The device, designed to detect enemy communications and jammers, was showing something that made no sense: a powerful electronic emission moving at high speed toward their position, but with no corresponding radar return on their Blue Force tracker. "Sir," Hayes whispered, tapping the device's screen with a gloved finger, "I'm picking up some kind of advanced electronic warfare signature inbound from the northwest. Whatever's coming, it's running full stealth." Reeves took the analyzer and studied the reading. The signature was unlike anything in their threat database, sophisticated beyond anything the Taliban possessed, but not matching any friendly aircraft profile either. The enemy fire from the valley had intensified as the afternoon wore on, forcing the SEALs deeper into whatever cover the rocky ridgeline could provide. Bullets whined off stone, sending sparks and fragments in all directions. Rodriguez had gone pale despite the morphine, his breathing shallow and labored. Time was becoming their greatest enemy, more dangerous than the fighters below. "Movement in the compound," reported Sergeant Kim from his sniper position 30 meters to Reeves' left. "Looks like they're bringing up mortars. If they get those positioned—" He didn't need to finish. Mortars would turn their defensive position into a grave. The high ground that had been their salvation would become their tomb. Reeves keyed his radio one more time, hopping against hope that their mysterious guardian angel was more than electromagnetic ghosts and wishful thinking. "Ghost Rider, Trident Actual. We are taking heavy fire and need immediate assistance. Our position is about to become untenable." "Copy, Trident Actual. I have you visual. Danger close in 30 seconds. When I tell you to get small, you get as small as physics allows." The voice was calm, professional, but there was something else underneath, an edge that spoke of someone who had danced with death so many times they'd learned all the steps. Reeves had heard that tone before, in the voices of pilots who flew missions that didn't appear in official records, who operated in the shadows between what was possible and what was necessary. "All stations, Trident Actual," Reeves broadcast to his team. "Prepare for danger close air support. Unknown friendly inbound." He could hear the skepticism in the acknowledgments from his men, but they were professionals. They'd take salvation from the devil himself if it meant getting Rodriguez to a field hospital. The sound came first, not the roar of jet engines they expected, but something else entirely. A whisper of displaced air, like the wind through a canyon, but moving too fast and with too much purpose to be natural. Hayes was staring at his spectrum analyzer with the expression of someone watching water flow uphill. "Sir," Hayes said, his voice tight with disbelief, "the signature just went completely dark. Whatever was coming, it's gone invisible." Above them, the sky remained empty blue, unmarked by contrails or the dark silhouettes of aircraft. But something was there, something that existed in the spaces between sight and sound, between official and necessary, between what the enemy could see and what they couldn't. The SEALs pressed themselves against the rocky ground and waited for their ghost to become real. The Taliban mortars coughed to life in the valley below, and Reeves knew they were out of time. Whatever Ghost Rider was, whatever impossible technology or classified program had found them in this forgotten corner of Afghanistan, it had better arrive soon. The first mortar round whistled overhead and exploded 20 meters behind their position, showering them with stones and dust. "Ghost Rider, Trident Actual," Reeves called, his voice carrying the desperation he could no longer hide. "Mortars are online. We need you now." "Copy, Trident. Ghost Rider is in the pocket. Get small." The voice on the radio belonged to Major Kestrel Banshee Thorne. though the SEALs below had no way of knowing that their salvation wore the gold oak leaves of a field-grade officer and had earned her call sign in the skis over Iraq 12 years earlier. She sat in the cockpit of an aircraft that officially didn't exist, flying a mission that would never appear in any after-action report, carrying ordnance that wasn't supposed to be in theater. The F-35C Lightning II she piloted was a standard Navy variant on paper, but the modifications made by a classified program known only as Nightfall had transformed it into something else entirely. The radar-absorbent coating wasn't just stealthy, it was adaptive, shifting its electromagnetic signature to match background radiation. The engines had been modified to run nearly silent at specific power settings, their heat signature masked by a revolutionary thermal management system that channeled exhaust through heat exchangers cooled by liquid nitrogen. "Banshee, this is Nightfall Control," came the voice of her handler, a man she knew only as Bishop, who spoke to her from a bunker somewhere in the continental United States. "Sitrep on your position." Thorne banked the aircraft slightly, bringing the Taliban compound into view through her helmet-mounted display. The SEAL team's position was marked by 8 small blue icons on her tactical screen, surrounded by a sea of red threat indicators. "Nightfall Control, Banshee. I have eyes on Trident Actual. Enemy strength is significant and our friendlies are taking heavy fire. Mortars are active in the compound. Request weapons free." "Banshee, Nightfall Control. You are weapons free. Remember, this mission does not exist. No evidence of your presence can remain." Thorne smiled grimly inside her helmet. The Invisible War had rules all its own, and she'd been playing by them for 3 years now. Her official record showed her stationed at NAS Oceana, flying routine training missions and maintaining proficiency in conventional aircraft. The reality was darker and more necessary. She flew missions that bridged the gap between what America's enemies expected and what America's friends needed. "Trident Actual, Ghost Rider," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the complexity of what she was about to attempt. "I have multiple targets in your vicinity. Stand by for precision strikes." Below, the Taliban fighters were moving with the confidence of men who believed themselves unseen by American eyes. They had no idea that death was circling overhead at 28,000 feet, invisible to their radar, inaudible to their ears, and guided by technology that made their Soviet-era equipment look like stone knives. Thorne selected her first target, a heavy machine gun nest that had been pouring fire into the SEAL's position for hours. The targeting pod locked onto the heat signature of the gun barrel, still hot from sustained firing. She didn't need a massive explosion, just precision sufficient to eliminate the threat without compromising her invisibility. The first sign that something had fundamentally changed in the tactical situation came not from the sky, but from the sudden, inexplicable silence of the heavy machine gun that had been the soundtrack to their nightmare for most of the day. Reeves was pressed against a boulder, watching his ammunition count drop towards single digits, when the distinctive sound of the PKM machine gun simply stopped. "Movement check," he called softly into his radio, ensuring his men hadn't been hit by the sudden cessation of fire. One by one, his team reported in, all still combat effective, all still pinned in place, but the immediate threat of the machine gun had somehow vanished. Through his scope, Reeves could see the gun position, but something was wrong with the picture. The sandbags were intact, the position looked undisturbed, but there were no muzzle flashes, no movement. "Ghost Rider, Trident Actual," he whispered into his radio. "Did you engage the machine gun position?" "Affirmative, Trident. Target neutralized. Stand by for additional strikes." There had been no explosion, no sound of aircraft, no indication that anything had happened except for the sudden silence where moments before there had been the chatter of automatic weapons fire. Reeves had called in hundreds of airstrikes during his career, had watched everything from A-10s to B-52s deliver ordnance on target, and he'd never seen anything like this. The second machine gun position went silent 4 minutes later, followed by the distinctive sound of men shouting in Pashto from the valley below. The enemy fighters were beginning to realize that something was hunting them, something they couldn't see or hear or understand. Fear was a weapon as potent as any bomb, and Reeves could hear it creeping into their voices. "Sir," reported Kim from his sniper position, "the enemy is starting to reposition. They're pulling back from their forward positions, moving deeper into the compound." This was both good and bad news. Good because it meant less accurate fire against the SEALs' position. Bad because it meant the fighters were consolidating into hardened positions that would be more difficult to attack. Rodriguez stirred beside the corpsman, his eyes flickering open despite the morphine. "What's happening, LT?" he whispered, his voice thick with pain and medication. "Guardian Angel Rodriguez, we got someone upstairs looking out for us." The wounded SEAL managed a weak smile. "About damn time." Thorne had repositioned for her next attack run, bringing the aircraft down to 15,000 feet to improve her targeting resolution. The adaptive camouflage system was working perfectly, bending electromagnetic radiation around the aircraft's fuselage in a way that made it effectively invisible to both radar and visual observation. Even the contrails that should have marked her passage were being suppressed by the atmospheric processors built into the engine modifications. "Nightfall control, Banshee. I'm seeing significant enemy repositioning. They're moving into hardened positions within the compound structures. This is going to require a more creative approach." Banshee Nightfall control. Remember your parameters. Precision only. No collateral damage, no evidence of advanced capabilities. The parameters were always the same. Achieve the mission objective while maintaining complete deniability. No burning wreckage that couldn't be explained by conventional munitions. No evidence of technology beyond what was publicly acknowledged. No proof that the United States possessed capabilities that its enemies didn't know about. Thorne studied the tactical display, mapping enemy positions against the compound's layout. The Taliban fighters had retreated into 3 separate buildings, using the civilian structures as both cover and psychological protection. They believed that American rules of engagement would prevent strikes against buildings that might contain noncombatants. They were wrong. Trident Actual Ghost Rider, I need you to confirm, are there any civilians visible in the compound? Reeves swept the area with his scope, searching for any sign of noncombatants. After 20 minutes of careful observation, he keyed his radio. "Ghost Rider, Trident Actual, no civilians observed. Compound appears to be military only at this time." "Copy Trident, weapons free on structures, danger close in 2 minutes." What happened next would be discussed in classified briefings for years to come, studied by intelligence analysts who would never fully understand what they were seeing. The 3 buildings that housed the Taliban fighters didn't explode, they simply collapsed, their structural supports severed by precision munitions so small and so precisely placed that they left no crater, no burn marks, no evidence of explosive force. The fighters inside the buildings had perhaps 10 seconds to understand that their world was falling down around them before the weight of mud, brick, and timber ended their contribution to the ambush. Outside the structures, the remaining Taliban forces found themselves suddenly alone, exposed, and facing an enemy they couldn't see, hear, or fight. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. These were hardened fighters who had faced American air power for over a decade, men who understood the sound of jets and the whistle of incoming ordnance. This silent, invisible death from above was outside their experience, beyond their understanding, and utterly terrifying. "Movement in the compound," reported Kim, his voice carrying a note of professional satisfaction. "The remaining fighters are breaking contact. They're moving toward vehicles on the eastern side." Reeves could see them through his scope, perhaps 15 men running in a loose group toward a collection of pickup trucks and motorcycles parked in a wadi beyond the main compound. They were abandoning their positions, abandoning their weapons, abandoning their mission. Fear had done what firepower couldn't. It had broken their will to fight. Ghost Rider, Trident Actual. Enemy is attempting to exfiltrate via vehicles to the east. Can you intercept? Negative, Trident. Let them run. Better they spread word about what happened here than become martyrs for the cause. The wisdom in that decision wouldn't become apparent until weeks later, when intelligence reports would note a significant decrease in Taliban operations throughout the region. Word would spread through the fighters' network about an invisible death that struck without warning, about American capabilities that defied understanding. Fear was a force multiplier, and sometimes the enemy you terrified was more valuable than the enemy you killed. For Kestrel Thorne, this was just another day at the office of the Invisible War. She pulled the F-35C into a climbing turn, taking the aircraft back to its patrol altitude while monitoring the tactical situation below. The SEALs would be extracted by helicopter within the hour, the wounded would receive medical attention, and the mission would be classified at levels that ensured it never happened. Nightfall Control Banshee, package delivered, Trident Actual is secure. Copy Banshee, RTB when ready, mission success. But as Thorne banked toward home, she couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was different from the others. Not because of the tactical situation, she'd handled worse. Not because of the enemy, she'd faced more dangerous threats. Something about the voice of the SEAL team leader, the calm professionalism in the face of impossible odds, reminded her of why she'd chosen this shadowy corner of the war in the first place. The invisible war was fought by invisible warriors, but the men and women they protected were very real. 8 American warriors were going home tonight because she'd been in the right place at the right time with the right weapons. That was what made the long deployments, the classified missions, and the official non-existence worthwhile. 20 minutes after the last Taliban fighter disappeared into the eastern hills, a pair of MH-60M Black Hawks appeared on the horizon, their rotors beating a familiar rhythm that sounded like salvation to the SEALs on the ridge. Reeves popped an infrared strobe to mark their position and began coordinating the extraction with the helicopter crews. Trident Actual, this is Dustoff 77. We have your position marked. LZ appears secure. How many passengers for transport? Dustoff 77, Trident Actual. 8 passengers, 1 urgent surgical. Be advised, we've had Angel support from an unknown asset. Situation is secure, but maintain caution on approach. As the helicopters settled into their landing pattern, Reeves tried one last time to contact their mysterious guardian. Ghost Rider, Trident Actual. We're beginning extraction. Request final status on your position. The radio crackled with static for long moments before the familiar voice returned, already sounding distant despite the crystal-clear transmission. Trident Actual, Ghost Rider. Mission complete. It's been an honor flying cover for you today. Ghost Rider, Trident. We owe you everything. Can we get your actual unit designation for our after-action report? The pause stretched even longer this time, and when the voice returned, there was something final about it, like a door closing. Negative, Trident. This conversation never happened. Ghost Rider out. The radio fell silent except for the coordinated chatter of the extraction helicopters. Reeves helped his men load Rodriguez into the first Black Hawk, ensuring the wounded SEAL was properly secured for transport to the field hospital. As the helicopters lifted off from the ridge, he took one last look at the compound below. The collapsed building stood as silent testimony to whatever had saved them, but there was no other sign that anything unusual had occurred. An hour later, in a debriefing room at Bagram Airfield, Reeves would find himself facing a collection of intelligence officers who listened to his story with expressions of professional skepticism. The official report would note that the SEAL team had been successfully extracted after being pinned down by enemy forces. The enemy casualties would be attributed to precision airstrikes from undisclosed assets. There would be no mention of Ghost Rider, no record of the mysterious aircraft that had appeared and disappeared without leaving so much as a contrail. The 8 men who had lived through the experience would carry the memory of that voice on the radio, but they would never speak of it outside their tight circle of brotherhood. Some secrets were too important to share. As Rodriguez was wheeled into surgery, the last thing he remembered was the sound of that voice, calm, professional, and absolutely confident, promising salvation from above. He would recover fully from his wounds and return to duty, but he would never forget the day an angel with a radio call sign had reached down from the invisible sky to pull 8 warriors back from the edge of eternity. In the end, that was all that mattered. 3 weeks after the extraction, Major Kestrel Banshee Thorne sat in a secure briefing room at an undisclosed location, facing a review board that existed in the shadows between military necessity and political deniability. The men and women around the conference table wore civilian clothes, but their bearing and the weight of their questions marked them as career military officers operating under deep cover. "Major Thorne," the chairman began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected global security, "your after-action report indicates complete mission success with 0 collateral damage and no evidence of advanced capabilities. How confident are you in that assessment?" Thorne sat at attention, her hands folded on the table before her. 3 years of flying Nightfall missions had taught her the importance of precision in both word and deed when dealing with the Oversight Committee. "Sir, post-mission satellite imagery confirms structural collapse consistent with targeted demolition using conventional munitions. Signal intelligence indicates the enemy has no knowledge of advanced aircraft capabilities. The cover story is holding." And the SEAL team. Their after-action report makes no mention of unusual aircraft or advanced capabilities. They've been debriefed according to standard protocols. As far as they know, they received air support from a classified conventional asset. The committee exchanged glances that carried meanings she wasn't cleared to understand. The invisible war had layers within layers, compartments within compartments. Even she didn't know the full scope of what the Nightfall program represented or how many pilots like her were operating in the shadows. "Major," continued the chairman, "your psychological evaluation indicates some attachment to the men you've supported in the field. Do you consider this a problem?" The question was expected. She'd seen it in her file during previous reviews. The assumption seemed to be that caring too much about the warriors she protected would somehow compromise her effectiveness or her ability to maintain operational security. It was a question that revealed more about the questioners than about her. "Sir, my attachment is to the mission. The men and women I've supported in the field are living proof that the mission works. Their survival validates the program and justifies the resources invested in these capabilities." "That's not what I asked, Major." Thorne considered her words carefully. The truth was complicated and personal, rooted in experiences that predated her selection for Nightfall. The official record showed a decorated pilot with multiple combat tours and an unblemished service record. It didn't show the reasons why she'd volunteered for a program that would erase her from history, that would turn her into a ghost flying missions that never happened. "Sir, every pilot develops connections to the people they support. It's what makes us effective in close air support roles. My concern is ensuring that American warriors come home alive. Whether they remember my call sign or not is irrelevant." The chairman made a note on his tablet before looking up again. "Your next assignment will be more challenging, Major. Intelligence suggests that near-peer adversaries are developing countermeasures to stealth technology. The invisible war is becoming more visible, and we need pilots who can adapt to changing circumstances." "I understand, sir." "Do you? The next phase of Nightfall will require operations in contested airspace against enemies who know we're there. The days of complete invisibility may be ending. Are you prepared for that transition? Thorne thought about the voice of Lieutenant Commander Reeves on the radio, the calm professionalism of men who faced death without complaint because they trusted someone was watching over them. She thought about Rodriguez in his hospital bed, recovering from wounds that could have been fatal if not for precision intervention at the critical moment. Sir, invisible or not, the mission remains the same. Bring our people home alive. The chairman closed his folder and stood, signaling the end of the formal review. But as the other committee members filed out of the room, he remained behind, his expression shifting from official to something more personal. Off the record, Major, what made you volunteer for this program? It was a question she'd answered for herself many times during the long flights over hostile territory, during the hours of waiting between missions, during the sleepless nights when operational security meant she couldn't even tell her family where she'd been or what she'd done. The answer was both simple and complex, rooted in a moment 12 years ago when she'd been the one calling for help. Iraq, 2013, she said quietly. I was a lieutenant flying convoy escort when my bird took heavy damage from a surface-to-air missile, went down in hostile territory with my WSO injured and unconscious, spent 18 hours evading enemy patrols before extraction. The chairman waited, understanding that there was more to the story. During those 18 hours, I kept hearing aircraft overhead, jets flying patterns that didn't make sense, engaging targets I couldn't see, providing cover that kept the enemy from finding us. Never saw them, never heard them clearly, but they were there. When the rescue helicopter finally pulled us out, I asked about the air support. And official response was that no air assets were tasked to our sector. Unofficially, the rescue pilot told me that ghosts had been watching over us. That's when I knew I wanted to be the ghost for someone else. The chairman nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a shared secret. Every Nightfall pilot had a similar story, a moment when they'd been saved by something they couldn't explain, couldn't prove, couldn't officially acknowledge. The program didn't just recruit pilots, it recruited believers. Your next assignment begins in 2 weeks, Major. You'll be briefing into a new aircraft type and a new theater of operations. The enemy is getting smarter, but so are we. Yes, sir, looking forward to it. As Thorne left the briefing room, she felt the familiar weight of secrecy settling around her shoulders like an old flight suit. Tomorrow, she would return to her cover assignment at NAS Oceana, flying training missions and maintaining the fiction of a normal career. Her fellow pilots would joke about her frequent temporary duty assignments, never knowing that their colleague was waging war in the spaces between official and necessary. The invisible war continued, and she was honored to be one of its ghosts. But that night, alone in her quarters, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction knowing that 8 American warriors were alive because she'd been in the right place at the right time with the right weapons. In the world of classified operations and compartmented programs, that was the only medal that mattered, the one that could never be awarded, never be acknowledged, never be officially recognized. The memory of Lieutenant Commander Reeves' voice thanking Ghost Rider over the radio was worth more than any decoration the military could offer. 6 months later, the ripple effects of that day in the Afghan mountains were still spreading through channels so classified that most of the people experiencing them had no idea they were connected to a single afternoon when 8 SEALs had been pulled back from the edge of disaster by an aircraft that didn't officially exist. In a secure facility outside Tampa, Florida, analysts pored over intelligence reports from across Central Asia, tracking a disturbing pattern in Taliban communications. References to silent death and invisible Americans had increased dramatically, with some fighters refusing missions in areas where similar incidents had been reported. The psychological warfare implications were being studied at the highest levels of Special Operations Command. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reeves, now back at SEAL Team 2 in Little Creek, found himself fielding questions from researchers who wanted to understand how close air support had evolved in the current operational environment. He answered their questions professionally and completely, describing effective coordination between ground forces and aviation assets without ever mentioning the mystery of Ghost Rider. Some secrets belonged to the brotherhood of warriors who had shared them. Rodriguez had made a full recovery and returned to operational status, but he carried something with him that couldn't be quantified in medical reports. During team briefings, when junior SEALs asked about calling for fire support in tight situations, he would tell them about trust, about how sometimes you had to have faith that someone was watching over you even when you couldn't see them. The other members of Trident Actual had scattered back to their various assignments, carrying their own versions of the story. In bars near military bases, when the drinks were strong and the stories were flowing, they might mention the day they'd been saved by perfect air support from an unknown asset. But they never mentioned call signs, never provided details that might compromise operational security, never forgot that some victories could only be celebrated in silence. Major Kestrel Banshee Thorne had moved on to her new assignment, operating an even more advanced aircraft in an even more sensitive theater. The technology had evolved, the missions had grown more complex, but the fundamental purpose remained unchanged: be the guardian angel that no one could prove existed. The F-35C she'd flown over Afghanistan had been retired from the Nightfall program, its advanced systems stripped and recycled into newer aircraft. The official records showed it had been lost during a training accident over the Pacific, its wreckage never recovered despite an extensive search effort. In reality, it had been broken down into components so advanced that they required special handling even during disposal. But in the memories of 8 American warriors, that aircraft would live forever as the voice of salvation in their darkest hour. They would never know the name of the pilot who had flown it, never understand the technology that had made it possible, never comprehend the classified programs that had put her in position to save their lives. They didn't need to know. The invisible war was fought by invisible warriors for people who would never see them coming and never know they'd been there. It was a war measured not in territory captured or enemies killed, but in American lives preserved and missions accomplished without acknowledgement. In the end, that was enough. The legend of Ghost Rider lived on in the whispered conversations between special operations personnel who had experienced the impossible and couldn't explain it. It became part of the mythology of modern warfare, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that never made it into the history books. Major Thorne continued her invisible war, flying missions that didn't exist to protect warriors who would never know her name. She carried the voices of the men she'd saved with her into each new engagement, their gratitude a fuel more powerful than jet propulsion, their survival a vindication of everything the program represented. The sky belonged to those who dared claim it, but the invisible sky, that realm between possibility and necessity, between official and real, belonged to the ghosts who flew in service of something larger than themselves. In that invisible sky, call signs like Ghost Rider and Banshee would echo forever, carried on frequencies that only the worthy could hear. And in the brotherhood of warriors who had been touched by that invisible hand, the story would live on, passed from veteran to rookie in the timeless tradition of those who had faced the impossible and lived to tell about it. They would speak of the day when death had seemed certain and salvation had come from the empty sky, delivered by a voice that promised everything and asked for nothing in return, except the chance to bring American warriors home alive. That was the true measure of the invisible war, not the technology that enabled it or the secrecy that protected it, but the lives it preserved and the hope it represented. In a world where shadows fought shadows and ghosts battled ghosts, the greatest victory was the simplest one. Another day, another mission, another group of warriors who would see home again, because someone they would never meet had chosen to stand watch in the invisible sky. The war continued, fought by pilots whose names would never be known, in aircraft that would never be acknowledged, for reasons that could never be fully explained. But for 8 men who had once been pinned down on a rocky ridge in Afghanistan, the war had a face and a voice and a call sign that would live forever in their memories. Ghost Rider out. Years would pass before the full implications of that afternoon became clear to the strategic planners and policymakers who operated in the highest echelons of national security. The tactical success was obvious. 8 American warriors extracted safely with zero collateral damage and minimal evidence of advanced capabilities. But the strategic implications were more complex and far-reaching. Intelligence reports from the region painted a picture of an enemy that was beginning to fundamentally alter its operational patterns based on fear of capabilities they couldn't understand or counter. Taliban commanders were avoiding operations in areas where ghost strikes had been reported. Recruitment was down in regions where stories of invisible American aircraft had spread through the local population. The psychological warfare value of a single afternoon's work was proving more valuable than months of conventional operations. In secure conference rooms across the Pentagon, briefers used the Afghan incident as a case study in next-generation warfare. They spoke in euphemisms and code names, referring to undisclosed assets and experimental capabilities. But the message was clear. The invisible war was proving its worth in ways that traditional metrics couldn't capture. The Nightfall program expanded its operational scope, deploying similar assets to other theaters where American forces operated in hostile environments. Each mission followed the same pattern: precision intervention at critical moments, delivered by assets that left no trace of their presence. The pilots who flew these missions became a new breed of warrior, fighting a war that existed in the spaces between official acknowledgement and operational necessity. Major Thorne had become one of the program's most experienced operators, her success rate in close air support missions approaching statistical impossibility. She'd saved the lives of dozens of American service members across 3 continents, operating in conditions that would have been considered impossible just a decade earlier. Her aircraft had evolved along with the threat environment, each new variant incorporating lessons learned from previous missions, each upgrade pushing the boundaries of what was technologically possible. But for all the advanced technology and classified capabilities, the mission remained fundamentally human. Every call for help that came across her radio was a person in desperate need, often with just minutes or seconds between life and death. The precision required to intervene effectively without compromising operational security demanded not just technical skill, but an intuitive understanding